Welcome, welcome. I'm so glad to see you all here today. My name's Judy Utah. I'm going to quickly share some slides to kick this off. So you are at an Autism and Entertainment webinar, and this one is about television animation writing for autistic writers. We have an amazing panel for you. If this is your first time at an Autism and Entertainment activity, our mission is to increase employment of work-ready autistic talent in the entertainment industry, and we're doing that by expanding what diversity means to include neurodiversity. We want to enhance the autism brand, your brand, so that people will value your talent and skills. We will be sharing resources. There's a lot of great resources out there from the government to help people hire you. And so we will be letting people know about that, and as well as enabling you to move on your career path and have that information you need to be successful, which is kind of the reason we're doing this webinar. I just wanted to point out that if you go to our website, we have all sorts of new events. Up here is the Autism and Entertainment webinar that we're having today. But I want to point out that we have a live event coming up next week at the Laugh Factory, which is a comedy night that a couple of folks who attended our Autism and Entertainment conference were inspired to create. And so this is going to be from 6 to 7 at the Laugh Factory in Hollywood. And I am going to spotlight Britt for everyone and introduce you to Britton Payne. Britton is a big supporter of the Autism and Entertainment movement. He is a vice president at Nickelodeon, working on the legal side of talent acquisition. And this is his dream child. He ran 2 other webinars for us. And welcome, Brett. I will be causing the members of your panel to appear for you in just a sec. So hi, Brett.
Hello, Judy, and hello, everybody else. Thank you so much for tuning in. I want to start by apologizing that I speak way too fast. Oh, and also, Robert, I guess if you can mute your Zoom, that would be great. And if anybody else has just double check that you're muted so that we can hear the panelists. So today's panel is going to be discussing television animation writing for autistic writers, preparing to make the most of opportunities. The reason we sort of styled it that way is because writing for animation and writing for television, especially, tends to be a freelance position that you are writing on a show for some amount of time, might be a small amount of time, might be a slightly longer amount of time, and then you're done. And then you have to get another opportunity to write. And it's constantly about trying to stack these opportunities on each other. So thinking of your career as an animation writer really is thinking about how to best position yourself for the opportunities to write. And sometimes that means do a good job on the one you're working on. And sometimes that means networking or finding out the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in today's panel. We have 3 terrific panelists. We have Whitney Wetta, who's a co-head writer and story editor for The Loud House. That's one of the shows that Nickelodeon does. And we have Keryl Brown Ahmed, who is a writer for Big Ethel Energy, which is a webtoon set in the Archie universe. And we have writer autism consultant Ava X Rigelhaupt, who is a writer for Carl the Collector and was an autism consultant for How to Dance in Ohio. So we're going to get to them very soon. But first, I wanted to lay a little bit of the groundwork for the session. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about the production process and a little bit of where writers will fit into that in animation. I'm an attorney at Nickelodeon. They don't let me do any creative work. It's probably very smart, but that's
Hi,
the
guys.
case. Hello. Let's make sure that everybody's got their
I don't think I can hear you.
Understood. But we'll see if we can figure that out. You might have to mute your camera before you'll be able to hear us. I don't know why that would make any sense, but so as an attorney, I get to see a little bit of every part of the process from start to finish. And so in animation, a lot of times that involves the acquisition of an intellectual property. So for example, Big Nate is a book that gets written. Nickelodeon calls up the rights holder for Big Nate, says, hey, we want to make a cartoon show out of it. And we pay some money, and then we put together a team that ends up making the Big Nate show. Other times it's something that is already in-house, that is a Nickelodeon program that starts as a Nickelodeon program, like Dora the Explorer, where we say, oh, we have the rights to Dora the Explorer. What's the newest version of that going to be? And then, so once that's all squared away, the pre-production begins. And that's, excuse me, not pre-production, development begins. And so that's where they are trying to put together the ideas for a new program, a new show, until it gets what's called a green light. And the green lights not only happen at the beginning of a show when it's created, but every season, every new season, they have to decide, do we want to come back for season 3 of Loud House? Do we want to come back for season 2 of Monster High? And those moments when they decide, yes, we're going to do it, that's called a green light. But to get there, you have to figure out the economics of the whole thing. You have to figure out who are the main creatives that are going to be on it. That might involve a showrunner who is the person who sort of is in charge of the whole thing, or in charge of the writing of the whole thing and sign a lot of the creative. It depends on how much money they think that they can make from either licensing it out to another company like Netflix, or to putting it on cable and selling ad space for it. So once they've sort of figured out their budget for that, then they start they bring it to the big executive and they say, here's our plan. And if they like the plan, they get a green light. So once the green light happens, it's off to the races. Then they start pulling in people to do casting, they pull in people to do writing, and they do, I guess, what's essentially pre-production. There's a little bit less of a discrete period of pre-production in animation because there's no live action shooting, but you need things like character designers. And for the purposes of today's meeting, you need writers. You probably need one person who's in charge of the writing, essentially. That might be the showrunner, is usually what that would be called. And then you need to pull on board probably multiple other writers. Sometimes there's a writing room where everybody sits around and they do what's called break the season, where they figure out what's the storyline going to be for this whole next batch of episodes. The batches of episodes in animation are often 11-minute episodes. You put 2 11-minute episodes together to make 1 half hour, and you probably have 26 half hours. 26 is half of 52, 52 weeks in a year. Historically, that's where the number 26 comes from. So you'll typically get an order of 26 episodes. Modern times sometimes has a lot fewer, but that's a pretty normal number. And you might have a writer's room, but you also might have everybody write at home. So one person will assign it out or have Zoom calls with people to say, hey, you want to write the episode where so-and-so goes to the prom or so-and-so buys a dog? And then they write it at home. So once a critical mass of scripts are written, they can start casting, they can start doing character design, they can start even doing audio recordings. And at a certain point, when the script is finished, the writer is done. But the episode might not come out for another 18 months after the writer is finished. There's a really long tail for animation production. Finally, once it all comes out, you've got what you see as a season, and they have to decide whether to do it all over again. The writers, meanwhile, have to find new work. So that's why you always want to be mindful of your opportunities as a writer. So to go from there, I want to talk to Whitney first. So how did I do as far as the production process is concerned? And specifically, where do writers have opportunities to come on board to a production?
Oh, thank you so much, Britton. That was like so well said and laid out. And I've been in several writing rooms. I started at Nickelodeon and I got to be in Robot and Monster, Fairly Odd Parents, Tough Puppy, Shimmer and Shine, My Little Pony, and then now Loud House. And so I can speak to what those rooms look like and how they function, but they're all so wildly different depending on what the story editor and showrunner want to do, the vibe, how they like to run things. And yet still you manage to cover very well how things are run. But I will say on Loud House, it's been my favorite experience. So I'll start with that. But there are 5 writers, and we have the biggest room at Nickelodeon and the luckiest room because we've been going for 10 seasons now, 9 seasons, 10 years. So we never had to stop. And like you said, Britt, look for work because we were still going. However, to answer your question, we always have room in our schedule for what's called freelance writers because it's just good to get variation, different voices in there, different ethnicities, different genders, different experiences, people with autism. And for them to come in and pitch a story it's always fresher than, something we've been talking about for months and months. And so they will come in, pitch a story, and just follow that one episode. And that lasts about a month of work. And it's a really coveted position. It's difficult to get, but it's not impossible. And to give you an example, we had Charlie Nooner, who I believe is neurodivergent, if not autistic, write a freelance episode for Loud House, maybe in season 3. And it was one of our most popular episodes. It was about Lana in a race car derby race. And he came in and crushed it. And we absolutely adored him. Never knew he had autism until way later in the process. Not that I think it's always wonderful to know that up front. I don't think it hurts you in any way. I think it only helps your ability to write, personally. But yeah, I feel like I'm rambling too much, and I'll give it back to you.
Well, yeah, but that brings up a good point. We have a bunch of things we'll talk about, and I do want to come back to the production process. But part of it is, if you're trying to get a job as a writer and you are autistic, there is some question as to when you should disclose. Ava, how should an autistic writer determine when to disclose their autism?
Yeah. First, thank you all so much for having me. I've heard really great things about this organization. Yeah, this question was like in the pre-planned questions given twice. And as I often say on panels that ask this question, it's like a tricky one and a really important one, and it could be its own hour-long panel in and of itself about disclosing. And it's really really personal decision. And so, for example, for me, for most recent writing jobs, including Carl the Collector, which is a PBS show airing November 14th, I think, 2024, so this year. And it's animation. It follows Carl and his friends in Fuzzy Town. It's PBS's first series, really centering an autistic character, Carl. They're all animals, which I love. It's really cute. He's a raccoon, and there's also an autistic, like, young girl, Lotta. And so for Carl the Collector, they were looking for autistic writers because the series features autistic characters, and the show's team is really dedicated to authenticity. Even before I joined, they were dedicated to authentic casting, and I later learned they have some autistic animators as well up in Canada. And so, of course, I disclosed. I heard about it from a friend of a friend, and she told me to pass my material on to, producers, and it kept changing who was joining on. But so in general, for me, it depends on how this team is introduced to me. Of course, if they say they're looking for autistic writers, I go right ahead and tell them and put all of that on my resume and highlight how I can bring my lived experience and also help explain and translate autism to a neurotypical audience. As being an autistic woman, I've really studied behavior and had to understand neurotypical people as well, just to get along, just to survive. And so, if these, in general, when you kind of meet with people and executives to introduce yourself, it really depends on how they were introduced to me. If they were introduced to me through like a disability-focused organization like this one, or another great one called Disability Belongs, used to be called Respectability, and they're trying to do the work to hire autistic talent, disabled talent, underrepresented groups, then, as I said, I tell them I'm autistic because they are looking for that. And they're people that maybe have a connection to the autism community. Maybe they're autistic or neurodiverse themselves. And sometimes if it's not quite clear on what they're looking for, and unfortunately, as we all know, there is a huge stigma around disability and autism, and you've met one autistic person, so every person's view of autism is different. Sometimes I'm hesitant, so sometimes I will just say I'm neurodiverse, and more people are getting used to that and kind of know what it means, but at the same time, no one knows what it means. So I've done that on my resume as well, tailored a resume and my little intro of myself, depending on who I'm meeting and what I think their needs are, and kind of the vibe that I get from them, and how they're introduced to me.
That's really great, Ava. Thank you. One of the things that you touched on was that you sometimes have to write for autistic characters and sometimes for non-autistic characters. Keryl, I wanted to ask you, how do you treat the voices for your characters, writing from the perspective of an autistic writer, when some of your characters are autistic and when some are neurotypical or neurodiverse in different ways?
That's a great question. Thank you for having me on the panel. First of all, very excited to be here. Okay. In terms of, so just a little bit about me, as Britt said, I write comics, and the biggest series that I've worked on has an autistic character. The comic is called Big Ethel Energy. It's on Webtoon. And in the second season, we use TV terms for the comics. It's very confusing. In the second season, there's an autistic character. So as Ava just said, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So when I approach dialogue in particular, for me, when I think about dialogue in general, I try to really study how, when I'm speaking to people, how they speak. And also how I speak, but it is like, I'm autistic and I also have ADHD, and it's like hard for me to listen to myself and them. And there's like 10,000 other things in my mind at the same time. But I try to sort of, even just like when I'm out and about, I try to listen to how people speak. And then sort of remember, like turns of phrase and the way I try to observe the way people interact with each other. And like, honestly, that really trained me in how to interact with other people and how to carry myself. And so that I use in dialogue as well. There's nothing wrong with modeling your dialogue off of the way you observe people speak in real life. That's exactly what you should be doing. And for my autistic character, same thing. I just wrote him the way he has a special interest. He talks a lot about his special interest. He brings the conversation back around to that a lot. So I made sure to include that. He takes some things literally. He doesn't take a lot of hints. That's just how his personality is. So I incorporated that as well. But every character is going to be different. And the most important thing for writing authentic dialogue is just taking in the world around you, and also reading a lot. Read books, read how other writers write dialogue, and pick up what, notice the things that you like. And, if you find a writer who you think does really great dialogue, read more of their work and see if you can pick up some, tricks of the trade from what they've already done.
Yeah, one of the big tricks of the trade, I suspect, is getting work in the first place. Ava talked a little bit about submitting to Call a Collector, because I imagine there was a call from the creators of the show looking for writers. But there are lots of ways to break in, especially to get your very first job. I'm going to share a little story that I heard when I was at Warner Brothers Animation. There was a show that had to crank out a lot of episodes every year. And there was one showrunner, a guy named Mike. And Mike really was interested in helping people be new writers. Now, part of that is because he had no money, or not no money. He had to pay the very bare minimum. Okay. When a show has to pay the bare minimum, once you can get on a show that pays more than the bare minimum, you leave the show that pays the bare minimum. But that's a great opportunity for somebody who wants to break in. And the way Mike used to find his new writers is that he had his reliable writers, or people that he'd worked with before. And if they recommended somebody, he would have lunch with them, and they knew the show that he worked on. And so those people would go to this lunch, Mike would get to know them. And if they seemed reasonable, then, and they would pitch Mike 5 ideas for the show. So it didn't involve any writing. It just involved coming up with ideas. And Mike would say, oh, those 3, we've kind of already done episodes of that. And this one is an interesting idea, but you send them to the moon, so it's probably going to be too expensive. But this 5th idea that you've got, that's pretty interesting. Why don't you write me an outline? And so that is how you would get your foot in the door with Mike. And then somebody like me would send you a contract and you'd sign it and stuff. But that was the breaking in point. Was there are really 2 parts to an episode as far as the writer's concerned. There's the outline and the teleplay. And sometimes they do both. And sometimes those 2 jobs are split, and sometimes it works by committee. But those are the 2 parts of the process. So that was a social way of breaking in. Not everybody's social looks the same as we see in the autism community, but it still is important. And it doesn't have to look like everybody else's social, but it does have to be social. Getting those kinds of not in-house, those recommendations, those friend of a friend type things, that's a really valuable path to try when you're trying to break in. Just as you have to have talent and you have to have other things, but if you write the most beautiful script in the world and then you put it in your drawer and no one ever sees it, you haven't really, you've only done part of the job. So that was one way of breaking in. Whitney, what's another way that you've hired writers, maybe even first-time writers, or that you've connected, or even stories of your peers or your first-time writing?
Absolutely. There's so many different ways. I've heard of, well, on our show Loud House, we've asked our executives for samples, and then they've reached out to agencies, and those agencies send maybe their top players or like people that are looking for work or people that they think would be a good fit. We've also had so much success from the internship program. We've hired like half of our room from there, as well as the Nick Fellowship program. Those are, yeah, any kind of workshop or fellowship, those are all great opportunities. Also, if we have an executive assistant or like a production assistant who's really interested in writing, they can sit in the room with us on our show and gain knowledge, access, and experience, and eventually they can move up and pitch ideas. And we've had several people go that path as well. And then also you've got the cowboys who reach out to you on Instagram, and every once in a while, you could have success with that, or maybe you run into somebody in person. I think we hired our production manager based on an interaction with her and my line producer at CVS. So you just never really know what kind of job opportunity is going to come your way. And one thing that helped me in those moments where I would get so nervous thinking like, can this lead to a job? Am I trying to impress someone? What are the rules here that I'm not picking up on? I would just go back to try to have fun and make them laugh. That's all. I don't have to name drop or say I'm from the fanciest college in the world. Like, if I made them laugh, maybe they'll remember me. And that's something that anybody can accomplish,
Yeah, one of the questions I think, so here's some of the questions that have come in through the chat. One I'm going to try and answer. It's how do you get to write your own show? And I think it's the same stuff that Whitney was just talking about. Okay, you could cowboy, you could just get lucky, walk in the door, have a brilliant idea, and that's what happens. Then suddenly you're granted your show. That seems extraordinarily unlikely. A good way to be able to walk in the door and get your own show is to already be famous. If Simone Biles walked into our offices and said, I would like to do an animated show, we would probably say yes. We would be very interested in that. And that's not to say that you have to go win the Olympics, but if you can find a way to burnish your reputation doing other things, making short films on your own and putting them online, putting stories online that somehow get famous, doing something like what Keryl's doing, and having a webtoon that you are consistent with, that writes great characters and has an interesting voice. We live in a world where you can get famous and not have to leave the house. So those are and that also starts building your hours too, right? You're getting this experience of writing. That said, you don't want to be getting experience writing badly. And there's a certain format to a script that you can expect. So I want to, either Ava or Whitney, if you want to touch into that, the question is, how do you write a script? And I think I would start by saying, following off of kind of what I'd said, we're talking about animation writing, and SpongeBob is 11 minutes long, right? So if you have to write an 11-minute script, what's the process from beginning to end? Ava, is that something you can talk about for Carl the Collector and your experience there?
Sure, yeah. I wanted to pop in and say actually that I was an intern at Nickelodeon in 2021 to 2022 virtually. So in the live action casting department, I actually just was able to tour the studios like a month ago when I was in Los Angeles for a work thing. And it was really neat. So I'm very I know the Loud House very well. I remember also casting the live action movie, all those interesting children. Yeah, it was really neat. And I also, since they knew I was interested in writing, got to sit in on some like faux writers' rooms with the Nickelodeon Writers Program. And those writers are really neat. Okay, so but your question was from, okay, how did you write a script? Yeah,
Just the
so
basics, right? About
for-
like the structure, how long is it? Yeah.
Yes, Carl the Collector is also 11 minutes long, and it is for ages 4 to 7 years old. So it's for kids. I know the Loud House is a little bit more middle school age. At least the kids are like 11, etc. So Carl, the kids are probably 4 to 7, but in my opinion, they're written a little bit more at an 8 or 9 years old. So if you know anyone who's 4 to 7 years old, tell them to watch it. And so we start with an idea, which is often called a premise. So for the Loud House, that's really neat. Seems like you have a writer's room. For Carl the Collector, like a lot of shows I wrote on Blue's Clues and Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, there's no writer's room. We're all freelance, and it's like writing your own little 11-minute movie. I hope to get into a writer's room someday for animation or live action to have that interesting collaborative experience. But for Carl, you come up with a couple ideas, and I send it to the head writer, who knows whether that idea is already taken. That's sometimes the tough part. And you work with him, and once one gets taken, once they really like a premise, you go to an outline, which is just a more fleshed out script. This is where every single person's outline is different. You're meeting with a couple of different writers through a program, and they're like, some people's outlines, some for more older adult, like Better Call Saul, their outlines are like 50 pages long, and some outlines are just like really short. It depends on what the showrunner and the team wants of how much detail. But as you go through your outline and take notes, the outline often comes the script, and you can almost copy and paste sometimes your outline from like the Google Doc, the Word, into Final Draft. And just instead of saying, my joke about writing for books, prose versus screenwriting, is that in books you say he said, and in screenwriting you don't. And you also can't go into the elaborateness of how beautiful the clothes are sometimes in screenwriting, which sometimes I'm sad that you can't go into all those details. But we try to align for kids' TV shows this interesting thing called a buy-up. You learn a lot of new lingo, and it's big idea operating principle. And so we are social emotional learning for Carl. So we're not teaching kids numbers and letters, which is good because I have a math disability. Writing for Blue's Clues was like tough. I'm struggling with the math there too. But so it's like sharing is caring, solving problems, strategies to try new things. And so once you go to outline, you work with PBS advisors that are executives, and also some of them that are also like external freelance that are early childhood education, early childhood development. We have an autistic advisor as well. They give you notes such as sometimes kids wouldn't say this word. So that goes to Keryl's thing of listening to your demographic, and also aligning it with the buy-up and saying, how about we tailor it a little bit towards this? How about we have them go through the steps of imagining what a new experience would be like. Or for autistic people, sometimes it's looking at pictures of what this room would be like that they've never been to. And so taking in these big idea operating principles, the learning principles, into the script, and working with advisors on how to align that with your idea. Sometimes they come up with a whole new script idea, like your scripted idea is really cool and they don't have a learning buy-up with it, so they just make one. And then once you've gotten a lot of notes on outline 1 and 2, then you go to draft. And by the time, in my opinion, you go to draft 1 and draft 2, notes are much more smaller. You're not making any overall changes to the script. You're just changing some words, or we already have a red bird, so let's use a red bird instead of a blue one, because then we don't have to draw it again. And different things like that. An 11-minute script is about 15 pages long, at least for Carl the Collector. And then once you have draft 2, me as a writer is done. Sometimes they make some extra tweaks during production, but that's mainly it. Most of my notes come through email. If I have any questions, I call the head writer via phone, who I've never even met in person yet, and we're all over the place. He's in like Chicago, and he helps me decide what notes to take, what notes to maybe leave behind. Sometimes you push back again on notes. Sometimes I was really wanting to get this, my idea wasn't getting across clearly, and they wanted me to change it, but I did not want to change my idea. In my opinion, it was a really authentic autistic mannerism. And so then I just kept working on putting it in a different way until the advisors got it. And so we work on how to do that and what notes to take and what notes to keep.
That's great, Ava. Keryl, Ava is talking about dealing with the people who are sort of in charge of the project or whatever. You're working with the Archie universe, with the Archie and Betty and Veronica universe, means that presumably you had to interact with whoever those rights holders were. Especially as an autistic person, how do you navigate those kinds of interactions when your creative idea is bumping up against what your bosses want?
That's a really good question. I was very lucky that they were very open to my ideas. They, there were certainly things that I had to change, and they did have notes that I had to address. But overall, I mean, I've found in general in comics, writers tend to be a lot more like trusted than in TV, which I've worked some in TV as well, not in animation, but at least in comics, it's like my experience has been I pitch ideas and they're kind of like, okay, cool, great. Let's do it. But there, of course there are, like with the Archie universe, because it is one, an existing universe, existing IP, and two, it is, I mean, it's for all ages, but particularly children. They do sometimes have content guidelines that we have to adhere to. And so the biggest thing is I found it very nice that my editors were quite communicative about why they needed changes when they did. But it's also not, it's not bad to ask for clarification when you need it. The biggest thing is to just approach it from a place of curiosity and not from defensiveness, because there might be some reason that has nothing to do with you. Like chances are the reason they need something changed is not personal in the slightest. It's not about you or your writing. It's just about, we need this character to adhere to these rules that are already set in the universe, or we need to use this location because, we already have the assets for that, or things like that. And I've been lucky that I've very rarely bumped up against, really sort of prickly editors. When it does happen, though, there is an element of picking your battles and deciding what you're willing to let go of in order to preserve the relationship. And, if you especially overall, like if you like working with them and it's just maybe there's an exec on the team that is a little difficult or something like, and you want to continue working with them, then you have to decide, okay, well, am I willing to let this go in favor of, continuing to work with these people? And it can be a little tough, but if you think about the fact that like, okay, if I let this go, I will continue getting work with them and I'll get more chances to write what I want to write in the future. That's sort of how I think about it. Does that answer your question?
It definitely does, Ava.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I have one more thing to add. Sometimes, writers often talk about the like notes within the notes. And when I was taking this was actually more of like a prose short story writing course. She had us do this, what they call like the Iowa writing thing. We don't do this in screenwriting because all of my notes come via email, but you give your script to everyone and stuff like that, and they give you notes. And sometimes you can answer a question or two if it's like, how do I pronounce this person's name? But you really are just there to sit and absorb all of everyone's critiques. And they also like give you handwritten copies of their like, scrawled over your paper. And I remember not in our class, but she told us one kid really struggled with it in a couple of classes that she's had. And he had to sit outside in the room and have a friend take notes for him because he couldn't not speak of defending his work. when someone said, I don't understand this, you'd be like, well, you know, and sometimes it's not personal. You just have to absorb the notes. And if everyone's saying the same thing, there probably is like some sort of miscommunication. And sometimes something funny happens that you and so the first round is just the premise getting accepted by the showrunner, the series creator, which is Zachariah O'Hora for Carl the Collector. And he's a really great guy. I met him a couple times in person because we were on panels that PBS was nice enough to bring us to. And so sometimes he accepts the premise just the way it is and he really thinks it's funny. We had a premise that was a little bit closer to probably like the ideas of like a SpongeBob. So kind of a little crass, a little bold. And then it was changed a little bit because the everyone's humor isn't always even the showrunner's humor. And so we just decided to alter it a little bit to tailor it much better to PBS audiences and the age group that we were writing for. And so that even happens. You know, the showrunner's idea, the first idea that the showrunner has, sometimes isn't even kept in his purity, even though he's the showrunner. And so you can see how much changes from one script to the very final end of it, just for all these different types of reasons. Though oftentimes at the end of the day, yeah, choose your battles. And if the showrunner wants to change, you often do the change. But luckily I was also working with a team that really understood where I was coming from, and really wanted my authentic experience. And oftentimes I find a way to meld in everyone's notes and ideas to make them pleased.
Yeah, well, it is important, Ava, that is very important that you know where people are coming from. Whitney, what's your experience with giving notes? I assume that you've been on both sides of that.
Absolutely. And Keryl and Ava made such great points. Like I'm taking notes for myself, just like these are such great notes that I wish every writer knew in the beginning, is that like not to take things personally and what is the note behind the note. And I struggled with myself with that for so many years, you know, bristling at first or wanting to defend your work until I realized, and this was a huge obstacle to overcome, falling in love with collaboration. Very, very difficult. But every time they gave me a note, I reframed it in my brain as, oh, here's an opportunity to put in my own joke again. Like you still can put your flair on it. And that kind of always helped me. And then knowing I'm a gun for hire at the end of the day, trying to make this vision come true. But I mean, if it's your own thing, wildly different. And then, like you said, Britton, in giving notes, at first, I was terrified because I didn't want any note to seem like I didn't like this part or I thought you were doing a bad job. And that almost froze me until I realized I could explain what was bumping me every time. Just you have to be able to just communicate it out. And as soon as they know why, there's no tension there. They were never like, you're so mean, you're cutting my whole script. They always understood if I was able to take a breath and explain what was bothering me here or what I thought would bother our showrunner or the executives. And another thing that helped me is just stepping out of the room, taking a long lunch, having a bath. Like I really had to just self-soothe to be able to give that much care to these people that I cared so strongly about.
Yeah, I think that's important, Whitney, too. And kind of some of what you're talking about are accommodations that you make for yourself, and that might be related to being autistic, and it might not. One, to put a cap on the subject of taking notes, a couple of the writers that I've known who were happiest, hopefully you're like essentially everybody on this call, you guys are idea machines. And if you get a note that says you can't have, I'm thinking specifically of a friend who wrote the Flash comic book. And he had turned in some script and they said, oh, you can't do this. And he says, great, I have 5 other ways to accomplish the same story writing goal. And so kind of like both what Whitney and Ava said is that what, you know, if something gets pulled in this episode, you might be able to get it back in a future episode. But also you're an idea machine. You have a million ideas. The idea that you put forth is not the most precious thing in the universe on an animated series, which is largely what we're talking about. We're not talking about movies so much, television animation. you've got a million ideas. And so you can let your brain run free and find a different way to solve that problem. And as the others have said, it's not necessarily you. Part of my job as a lawyer when I was at Warner Brothers Animation was to help figure out whether there was a legal risk in doing such and such. So if Clayface on the Batman show disguises himself as Bruce Springsteen, which might be a wonderful idea, and maybe would be the kind of thing that we would shy away from for legal or relationship reasons, you have to solve your problem, and you can either fight me about it, but I'm A, not that important, and B, probably the final word on the subject. So just get used to the idea that you have so many great ideas. You don't need this one to be awesome. You've got a million other ideas for being awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about accommodations, and once you've gotten a job, what kinds of accommodations you can ask for as an autistic person. Whitney, you told me beforehand that somebody you worked with was autistic, although you didn't necessarily know at the time they were writing with you or that they were writing for you. But what accommodations have you been in a position to make? And then Ava, I'll follow up what accommodations with what accommodations can people expect to ask for and hear a yes? So Whitney, I'll start with you though.
We are so open to whatever makes you the most comfortable, because when the writer's the most comfortable, you're going to get the best product. So if that means working at home on Zoom, if that means turning your camera off, if that means muting, if that means being home so you can have your cat there, like whatever you need, we really listen to and try to accommodate as much as we can in terms of a production schedule. And I can't remember a time when anyone has ever asked for more time on something that we weren't able to give it to them. So I would say, whatever you need, really, don't be afraid to ask for it, because you can give.
In terms of individual communication. Oh, so sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, I'm
the
so
question
sorry.
is about then the follow up is, how about on individual communication, whether it was related to autism or not? Has somebody ever said like, hey, when you give me notes, can you treat me a little differently? Because those are also accommodations that people might ask for. I'm curious, in practice, obviously you seem like the type of person who would be very willing to make those sorts of accommodations, but what kinds of accommodations have you had experience with?
A lot of people prefer written notes instead of in person. And gosh, Ava, do you have any specific examples too? I'm trying to think, because it's such a good question.
The only example that I was thinking of, because I know people have like a notes call where there's probably like a phone call kind of like this, or just a speaker call. All of my notes are given via written because we all live on different time zones and everyone's all over the place. But sometimes when working with people, even outside of this, sometimes I tell people that I'm taking notes, like if I'm in a meeting like this, or that sometimes even after the meeting, I might have more questions because it takes me a little bit extra time to process. And what's really interesting is that there's this nonprofit theater organization called Collab in New York City, and they work with people with developmental disabilities. And they have this kind of rule of thumb that when asking someone, especially like a question or a request, to wait about 10 or 15 seconds and like literally counting in your head before asking another question or before asking if the person understood. Because oftentimes people with developmental disabilities have a slower processing speed, and they might not give you the traditional, more or less neurotypical cues that they heard you and or an immediate response. And that happens with me too. So, but then sometimes someone will ask their question again because the person seems to not have answered them in the speed that they expect, or then they would ask 3 more questions as a follow-up. And so that's just an interesting rule of thumb that I learned from Collab, that I worked with them on the Broadway musical How to Dance in Ohio. And so oftentimes that does happen a lot with neurotypical people working with autistic people. They wonder why you're not responding, because oftentimes there is a immediate response. That is if you're working in person.
So Ava, I wanted to ask you about more profound traits of autism. So what concerns may arise when a writer has more profound expressions of autism, like being non-speaking, for example?
Yeah, I'm always not quite sure what you mean by this question. You asked this in a previous panel. My first thing when I was answering this is that, just to really ask people, what do you need? What do you need to do your best work? And listen to the autistic person. Oftentimes people, like the executives or the bosses, if they're not autistic, they're like wondering to their friends or to other people about like, how can we help accommodate this person, etc. And people, another friend perks up and is like, did you just ask them? Like, what if you just ask them, you know? And so that goes for accommodations for anyone with any type of disability. And it really is on a case-by-case basis. Everyone needs something different. And be willing to learn and keep an atmosphere where if they need any accommodations, throughout the process, you know, not just at the moment that they got hired, that they feel free to speak up. And of course, according to like, I think it's called like Ask Jan, the Workplace Accommodation Network or something, most workplace accommodations are free or cost less than $50. So making accommodations it's not overall as much of an overhaul as you think. It's just being open to learning.
Yeah, and I think the self-advocating is also a lot of what we've been talking about here. As an executive, I encourage people to speak up about accommodations they may need. And if that becomes an obstacle at the early phase of getting or starting a job, then it doesn't feel maybe like it's a good fit. And you shouldn't have to walk away from a place just because they are put off by accommodating. But, you know, not all places where you're going to seek work are Nickelodeon, which I think is, you know, making genuine efforts to be accommodating to all people. They, from the inside, you know, they can't always do everything they want to do, but they are certainly open to it. And if you find yourself applying for a place or looking for a job at a place that's not open to accommodating you, then there are a million other places where you can. You may as well say it out loud. And I'll bet or communicate it clearly. I guess say it out loud. I'm not trying to be ableist on that one either. But communicate it clearly, because you may find that the people on the other side of the table are more interested in accommodating than you initially expected. So just like you as the writer would hope that somebody give you the benefit of the doubt, you may as well give them the benefit of the doubt too. I don't see any downside to that. So I have a question too. Keryl, what are or Ava, whoever wants to answer it, what are common traits of autism that are a benefit to an animation writer?
I think a big one is taking things literally. Definitely autistic characters who take things literally. I mean, like, I don't know about any of you. I don't know if anybody knows Amelia Bedelia. So when I was a kid, there were these books that were, the character was Amelia Bedelia, and she was a maid in a house, and she took everything literally. I can't even think of an example right now. Whitney, if you can think of one, let me know. But like, she just like throw a picnic, and she would like take food and throw it instead of, you know, setting up a picnic. And like, it just little things like that can be really fun. For me, you know, having characters like Gilbert in Big Ethel, he would sort of misinterpret things or miss clues. And here's the thing, like in his case, he didn't do it intentionally, but I also think sometimes it can be funny when a character, because autistic people are consciously funny too, you know, like we have senses of humor just like anybody else. And so like, you know, even in my own life, sometimes I'll like purposefully miss a little cue here and there and give my friends a laugh. And you know, you can give your characters these little quirks and, you know, just sort of own the fact that like we operate a little differently, which is fun. And, you know, it should be enjoyed and used to the show or the comic's advantage.
We have about 10 minutes left. I want to bang out a couple of questions that aren't autism specific, but maybe are useful information. One is, can new writers join long-running shows? The answer is yes. A lot of times long-running shows are sick and tired of each other, and they're looking desperately for new ideas of how do we tell, a season, another Loud House story set in season 10. So new writers definitely are something they look for. Is a manager lower tier than an agent? I think that's an interesting question. From my perspective, a talent or a writer is much more likely to change agents than managers. So the manager is more likely to be closer to the talent. Lower tier, that's a different question. The agent is the one who can procure the work. The manager is the one who manages a career and helps with the bigger questions. BIOP, big idea operating principle. Is that right, Ava? Did I get that acronym correct? Okay. There's a question about, can you contribute from other parts of the process? The answer is similar to the other question about on a long-running show. Absolutely. If you are pushing a broom and you walk by a room and you sneeze and trip and fall, somebody in the room is going to be like, that was funny. Can we work that into an episode? And so the ideas can come from anywhere. It doesn't mean you get turned into a writer on the show, but kind of like Ava's experience probably doing the internship, and certainly Whitney was talking about a very common path to becoming a writer is to become a writer's room assistant or a person whose job is just to take notes and, I don't know, go get more donuts. By being in the room, you're learning how the process works. And so just because you're not a writer doesn't mean you can't contribute. In one of the last projects, the project that I did with Authentically Creating Autistic Characters, one of the writer's assistants on a show proposed an episode of Ava to a Scientist, and it was based on her non-speaking autistic brother. And then that got championed by that show and turned into a full-on episode. How do you get an agent? I don't really know. I'll ask you guys if you guys have agents, but the main answer seems to be get work. and then an agent will say like, oh, well, maybe you needed me to take 10% of your money to help you find your next job. It's kind of a catch-22. It is hard to break in. There are lots of paths and there are no paths. It really is a little bit perplexing. There's no one way to do it. Finding an agent is one way, but it's certainly not the only way. What's the difference between a pilot and a standard episode? A pilot, they tend to put a little bit more energy into. Not all animated shows start off with a pilot. Some of them get an order to the first season, so they already know they're going to do the first 26 episodes. Sometimes there's an interesting production process where the pilot episode will be the 8th or 9th episode that they make, because they have a per episode budget for character design. And so if you want to have all 9 of your new characters in the pilot episode, you might have to wait until 4, 5, 6 episodes into production before you can have all of those assets ready to go to tell the story. Yeah, Ava.
There are some really great pilots that you can watch. Some of them are live action, some of them are like Modern Family, when I was applying to different things. And you can find lists of them online of some of the best pilots for, half hour or hour or animation, etc. And it's also oftentimes, if it's not like a show that's bought, knowing how many episodes they have, it's a standalone episode that does 2 things. It stands alone on its own, just in case it doesn't get bought. Everyone just watches one pilot, like, oh, that's it. But it also leaves room for more episodes coming. So it's a tricky thing to write because you have to introduce all your characters and like the big setups and the big overarching themes and who they are. Modern Family does a great job. And Never Have I Ever as well. Every single time the person is introduced, you know exactly how it's going to go. But it's also standalone, especially like Modern Family or something, that if it didn't get bought, it wouldn't be like, I don't know what happens at the end, so that's also what a pilot is.
And then there was a question about alexithymia and other unique expressions of autism. And I think I would just kind of push people towards Keryl's answer, that whatever the thing is that maybe makes you a little different from other people is a strums to writing for an animated program, because then you have the opportunity to show something that maybe hasn't been shown before. How many times have you watched a TV show, especially a kids TV show, and been like, oh, the 90,000th prom episode or the 90,000th, Halloween episode or something like that? Well, they still need jokes, they still need characters. And if you can contribute something new and different, maybe that's your strength. Maybe that's something to lean into. So I wanted to throw to Whitney. We didn't exactly talk about when in the process do writers get hired. Is that something that you can speak to?
Totally. So when the pilot gets picked up that Ava was talking about, you usually have a budget to start hiring writers there. And I know that Nickelodeon has been fighting, the guilds have been fighting for at least 3 writers in every room, because right now that's always not always the case, unfortunately. And even we've had later in the process, writers will leave to go on another show. Maybe they want to try live action, or their pilot got picked up or something. So we'll always have to fill those spots. So yeah, we're always looking for new talent. And I think these guys said it best, like there's so much creativity in this room and problem solving and new fresh ideas that need to get out there. So just don't give up and get your stories out there.
Ava, I wanted to throw what's probably going to end up being the last question to you. So you are also an autism consultant in addition to being a writer. Given that we only have a couple minutes left, what is the job of an autism consultant as it would affect an autistic writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Carl the Collector has an autism consultant. It's not me. It's Dr. Stephen Shore, and he looks over all the scripts. And as they say, you've met one autistic person, you've met just one autistic person. So getting different perspectives also helps. He's so we have Carl and Lotta. Carl's a young autistic boy. Lotta's a young autistic girl. And it's really neat writing their traits of showing their similarities and their differences. And since I'm not an autistic boy, sometimes Stephen Shore gives his perspective on that. And also, so a consultant's role is sometimes just to ensure authentic autism representation, while a writer, regardless of whether they're autistic or not, is to write the script, to pay attention to a lot more facets of the story. So it helps to have someone, because I've been like an autism consultant on the other end for like the Ghost and Molly McGee, or Cha-Cha Real Smooth, to shows. Ghost of Molly McGee is Disney animation, Cha-Cha's like live action movie. And you have a different objective. I was just looking over the script to see authentic autism representation. It didn't matter to me. Sometimes I would pop in and be like, this story arc is a little confusing, but it wasn't my job to make sure that the characters are the same, or that, that the story arc is the same throughout the script, or that the other characters are just as well fleshed out. So it helps to have someone to have a different set of eyes and to have that specific job that isn't to make sure the whole script goes well, but more or less to make sure, especially for an autism consultant, that the autistic representation is authentic and also true to that character that everyone decided how their traits are going to be. And it's more the consultant's job sometimes, depending, to like teach the production. That's what I did on the Broadway musical How to Dance in Ohio, like about autism or about disability. It's not the writer's job or the actor's job, hopefully they cast authentically, to do that extra heavy lifting, which becomes an extra job. Oftentimes people aren't compensated for it, but if you do put that on the actor or the writer, it's extra work and they should be compensated for it, or hire a consultant to take that work off the actor and the writer. During an episode of, I didn't work on it, but I heard about Only Murders in the Building, there was a deaf actor and a ASL interpreter to interpret, and also deaf consultants. And the ASN interpreter was for the actor and maybe the consultant. I can't remember if the consultant only spoke ASL. And the consultant helped teach the production about deaf culture, look over the script, even do small things about how a deaf person's house might be set up in contrast to maybe a hearing person's house. And it was not the actor or the interpreter's job. And the actor talked about this on a panel of just how much work that was like off his shoulders. He could just be an actor, which is a hard enough job, to focus on his script and his lines, and work with the interpreter, so everyone could understand him, while the consultant did some of more that educational things that he didn't have to do, and he could really focus on his role.
That's great, Ava. Well, look, we hit 1 o'clock. I'm going to hit Whitney with the last question, though, because it's the one that I think is on everybody's mind who's tuning in. How do I get hired? And Whitney, we've already talked about how there are a million different ways that you can find your way in. Some of them are non-conventional. Some of them have not even been invented yet. But if you could suggest to someone trying to break into animation, to sell their first script or to get their first job, what would you say is probably the best odds, probably the best path for getting hired?
Great question. I would say have your material as polished and ready to go as you possibly can. And then it's all about networking and meeting people and finding out opportunities. And as soon as you're plugged into that, it's such a small community. I hope that's a good answer.
That's a terrific answer, but it's an important one for everybody to hear because it's going to be outside of a lot of people's comfort zones, whether you're autistic or not. Not everybody loves being social. Sometimes people become writers because they don't want to deal with other people. And yet here we are. It's still an important part of the process. So the fact that you've come to a big Zoom call like this, and that there are 120 other people on this call who have similar interests, it would be worthwhile through Autism Entertainment to find each other and to set, writers groups and to get together every now and then and to share your scripts with each other. Don't be super precious about the copywriter stealing ideas or whatever. Everybody's got their own ideas. They don't need yours unless they think they can put it on TV. Otherwise, nobody really knows what's a good idea or not. So share them freely, talk with each other openly, make connections with other people, invite writers to come in. I'll bet if you had a writers group and you called up somebody like Ava or Keryl or Whitney, you could play on their ego to come and join you for one night. I certainly would, except for I'd be useless. And then that's part of how networking works. Those are some of the things that you can do. All of the things that you do to make connections with other people are the kinds of things that are going to be useful as you try to get work as an animation writer. So I want to thank Ava and Whitney and Keryl for joining in. This is how they applaud at my kids' school. So that's what I'm going to do too. It is now 1:02, so we're over time. Ava, Whitney, and Keryl, you guys are free to go. Thank you so much for giving us this time and being able to speak with Autism and Entertainment. Thank you, Judy, for pulling it together. And we're going to leave this open for a minute. As far as I know, Judy, you can pop in if you feel like it. But anybody who needs to go, you could go. Anybody who wants to stick around, we can have a much more casual part of the conversation. But the formal part of this session is over. And thank you all so much for coming. So I'm going to say goodbye and then I'm going to stay, which is weird.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for organizing it. I feel like I learned so much. For real,
yeah, that's fun.
So wonderful.
I mean, I have a little bit of insight into the inside of, one of these big animation companies, and Nickelodeon is part of Paramount, and it's a big company. And it's funny because there is an interest in all kinds of representation and inclusiveness and stuff like that. But it's also challenging for a lot of different reasons. They have a lot of different masters, and they are individual people who have good hearts, but also have budgets, and like half of my team got laid off 3 weeks ago. The lawyers got laid off, and we're seeing significant cuts, and cable television isn't bringing in as much money as it used to, and streaming money isn't replacing the lost revenue from ad sales. So the number of shows might cut down, and people can't always act on their best impulses, even if they wanted to. But it is nice to see that on the inside, people want to make those opportunities happen. And in my opinion, the way, if you're an autistic writer or actor or voiceover person or anything like that, is to, I was about to say something, be irresistible, be great and do exactly what Whitney said, be polished and ready to go. More crassly, look like a big bag of money. I heard there's somebody out there who's saying like how to break into showbiz, and that's his sort of top line. And if you can figure out what that means, I don't know, that's a way to do it. Whitney, how did you break in? I don't know that we got to that.
I was a cowboy and got on the Nickelodeon Facebook and messaged them so many times, the Nick Writing Fellowship program specifically, and they offered that they were going around the country and stopping at colleges. So I said, why not Chicago? Why not mine? And they said, sure. And they stopped, and our TV department decorated the whole floor with Nickelodeon slime, and they were kind of blown away by that. And I just rode those coattails. And I went up to the lady and I said, can I intern for you this summer? And she said, we don't usually have interns in the summer, but okay. I mean, you're standing right there in front of her, And then I moved to Los Angeles. And after I interned at Nickelodeon, I went to everybody in the studio and said, I'll take any job you have here. I just want to be here. And they passed me around as the shows would end. And then I eventually landed on Loud House. So I got lucky.
And I assume that was invaluable experience, just being around all those things, right? Whatever. I was thinking about somebody else who wants to get into voice acting for cartoons. And any way you can get in the building, I think is a good start. There are most of the people who are tuning in obviously are thinking about creative stuff, but you might have a good organizational mind. You might be good at computers. You might be willing to work weird hours. Like, I don't know. There are all kinds of jobs that are not the creative jobs, but that still need to be done. And by being in the building, I mean, I'm just a lawyer and I have a sense of how the flow of work goes and what might be a valuable script and what would be too expensive to be able to do. And also seeing how overburdened people like Whitney are with their time. You know, she doesn't have time when she needs a new writer to do a nationwide search for the most, you know, the most merit-based hire. You know, she needs to have shortcuts. And by being in the building, by understanding how that process works, and by networking, you put yourself in a better position, I think, to break in. Just by, even as a security guard, like just by being there, I think is helpful.
Absolutely.
Hi, Britton. I hate to cut this short, but apparently I have another webinar that I don't know what it is. So I have to end this meeting, unfortunately, but thank you
Judy's good work
so
is
very
never
much.
done. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay.
And please, you know, reach out if you have any further questions through Judy. Autism Entertainment is a wonderful organization that is looking for ways to help you. And so hopefully they can. Bye, everybody.
Bye all.
Bye.